Okay, Courtney, thank you very much for making the time today to be on the podcast, our first video podcast that will go on YouTube.
Yeah.
So, yeah, not quite sure how that's all going to work out. So, we're going to talk about COVID-19. Clearly, it's impacting everyone's lives around the planet. We've been bombarded with a media frenzy unlike anything we've ever experienced. Yep. Whether it's the WhatsApp groups we're all part of, the Zoom rooms that we're continually sort of drawn to. Yes. This media maelstrom is just unrelenting, and that's not even mentioning the White House briefings.
Yes.
But besides the pandemic itself, having already claimed a lot of lives, it's the impact on another global pandemic, the mental health pandemic, that I think we're more concerned with. Yes. And while I think the figures are something like over 260 million people are suffering from depression around the world, and I think the US is in this 50, 60 million level, I think the Lancet I read had already warned that the mental health effects of COVID-19 could exceed the physical impact that it's having.
Right.
So after all these weeks of isolation that we're all going through, some of us, more isolated than others, the sales of comfort foods are up, the sales of alcohol are up, the use of cannabis is up. For all the things we're taking refuge in, may have an impact that its impact may take some time to unravel. So we have to be thinking about our mental well-being, all of us, regardless of where you sit in that spectrum of health and to illness, about looking after ourselves. So we wanted to invite you on to talk about resilience and the steps we can take, given that you were one of our early guests and that you have your own practice. So maybe you could just start, and for people that haven't seen the original podcast, introduce yourself, the work you're doing in New York, and how you're navigating this crisis at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Virtually.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. So, as you're saying, Mark, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I have a group practice in the Tribeca neighborhood of New York called Rennicke Associates, aptly named. And we're a group that really kind of looks at therapy and looks at healing through a lens called the attachment theory, or kind of we're attachment focused group. And what that means maybe is going to be something that's really relevant to our conversation today, because I think the lens that I really want to talk about resiliency through is through a relational community lens. And I certainly can talk more about what that means. Our practice really kind of got its start working a lot with adopted children and families. So that's also kind of a thread of my kind of story. And maybe particularly relevant to today, one thing I just wanted to mention that I was realizing I was kind of getting a bit emotional about in anticipation of this conversation was that my doctoral work was actually on trauma and resiliency following 9/11 in high exposure folks that were in the World Trade Center towers or right around it. And so kind of retracing my, how to think about resiliency really took me back almost 20 years now to those emotions of being, I think at the time I was a 23, 24-year-old graduate student, and what I was experiencing emotionally at the time and kind of what my intellectual journey was under the mentorship of George Bonanno, who's still actually up at Columbia University. He'll be certainly mentioning again. So I just want to say kind of that's maybe a bit of my framework in coming to this, that my kind of entryway as an adult in the city was 9/11. And my entryway to thinking about trauma and resiliency and how do human beings cope with stress was kind of through that lens, and is now kind of been shaped also by my work working with developmental trauma in adoptees and also with adults as well and their families. So maybe that's just to begin with a little bit of kind of the background that I want to bring to the conversation. And I guess maybe as a place to start, I know we've kind of been talking about this in the other chat rooms and Zoom rooms and kind of just friend support groups that we've been participating together. And I think all of those statistics that you're naming are really daunting and really overwhelming. And I guess I want to bring at least some of the lens that we can kind of look at of not just what's happening right now with mental health, but what does epidemiology kind of tell us about what this is going to look like in 2 months from now and 3 months from now and a year from now. And I think this is maybe we're coming back to my doctoral work at Columbia with George Bonanno. I owe him a huge debt of gratitude because when 9/11 happened, he thought very paradoxically from everybody else, which was he didn't think that we were going to see such massive spikes in the rates of mental illness diagnoses. It was going to be very, very clear that there was going to be much, 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 much higher rates among people who were in the World Trade Center and immediately surrounding the area that actually witnessed and experienced the event firsthand. Mm-hmm. But his whole thing was that our systems are kind of built for this. We don't think about it much. We don't think about, we kind of think as these kind of, it's an absolutely unique event to our history as human beings on the planet in terms of our awareness of it and how we're experiencing it, because we can actually know that this is happening globally. But concerns about illness and death and isolation and how our nervous systems and our emotional systems process this, I guess that the thing I always take from George Bonanno is that we were kind of built for this. And so sometimes what we see acutely is different than what we see over the long term. So maybe that's just kind of the first thing that I maybe want to kind of offer to the conversation.
So when you say we're built for this, do you mean in terms of my simplistic explanation and way of understanding what you're saying? Is it the amygdala and our fight and flight reaction that's kicking in, and that's why some people are fighting and others are in flight and they're or trying to escape from it?
Absolutely. So maybe it'd be kind of, I know it's like, maybe it's helpful for me. I know it's kind of helpful in conversations I have with our clients to maybe get a little bit more of a baseline of like, what are we going to be talking about if we're talking about, we're built for this, right?
Yeah.
So you were mentioning fight or flight, but I'd maybe want to extend kind of the spectrum of what we're thinking about. And so that there's a researcher named Stephen Porges who has this kind of theory called the polyvagal theory, which sounds like a mouthful, right? Like, please don't give me something big to think about when I'm struggling and I'm trying to figure out what to do. But I think that he and his colleague Deb Dana have tried to make this really approachable to understand. How does our nervous system work and how did it evolve? At kind of the earliest phase, what we share as human beings with every other creature on this planet that's sentient is that we start with our nervous system with something called a freeze response, right? When we're in danger, when we're under stress, we have something kind of in our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of the nervous system that slows us down, that helps us to survive under stress by freezing. So if you think about deer in the headlights, right? Or animals that quote unquote play dead, like a possum plays dead. These are kind of located in the part of our kind of polyvagal nervous network of nervous system in our dorsal kind of vagal response. What does that mean? How can we make any sense of that? I think if you're going to think about thinking for yourself of the waves of experiences you've had after kind of the COVID-19 pandemic hit and then impacted all of us in terms of self-limiting at home, we can probably think of moments where we felt more despondent, low energy, maybe if not ourselves, have talked to friends who are really struggling to kind of get out of bed, find the resources to do what they normally would do. And so when we're thinking about that, we're thinking like that's somebody who's maybe getting stuck or is maybe spending more time in kind of this dorsal part of their nervous system. I think one of the things that Deb Dana likes to talk about is like, give that, for our conversation, kind of to give that some kind of color or experience that kind of makes sense, because dorsal vagal is like, ugh, it doesn't make sense. But to think about, either a geographic place you've traveled to that's really dark or gloomy. Like I'm thinking of sometimes where I went to college up in Ithaca, New York, those winters, the gloom and the ice storm. And I think sometimes my isolation moments as a college student feels like that dorsal place that we all have within us. It's not unique to certain people. We all have it and we all travel in and out of it. So that's kind of the first block. So that's freeze. Then we get to kind of this other part, which you're talking about in terms of fight or flight, which absolutely the amygdala is involved with it. And how we think the amygdala is involved with it is part of a whole network of how do we as human beings detect fear and stress? We do it out of conscious awareness, right? The term that Stephen Porges gives us as in part of thinking about when do different parts of this polyvagal system get activated is a term called neuroception. And what does neuroception do? It's like why we can start moving away from the snake on the path before we see it. That we have a system that's built for fight, for mobilization, not up in our prefrontal cortex where we can reflect and think, but just helps us to survive. So some kind of indications that your nervous system might be in more of a kind of sympathetic or mobilized moment is feeling that charge of panic. Folks that are saying, I can't sleep through the night. I'm waking up in the middle of the night. I'm having more panic. I'm having more fear. I'm having more terror. My body is literally feeling charged up. Also people, I think, who are feeling kind of the antsiness around, I'm feeling cooped up and I feel like I can't get out. We're in as part of our system that, again, everybody has, which is kind of the sympathetic system, which also is related to fight or flight, right? It's both the dorsal part of our system, the dorsal vagal, and the sympathetic system. They're on all the time. The dorsal system's kind of like, it's like our basic utilities. It keeps things functioning, right? Under stress.
It's just ratcheted it up. It's up at 99% at the moment.
Exactly. It might be for some people. And our sympathetic system is like our alarm system in our house. It's on, like it's your alarm systems are on, they're installed, but they don't operate until we're under stress, right? Yeah. And the next part, which is kind of where I want to maybe make the conversation relational, and maybe I want to kind of use it as part of the foundation to describe what does relational resiliency look like, is this ventral vagal part of our system, which Stephen Porges calls like our friend part of the system, which is what we understand from attachment literature is that how our bodies get regulated well is from that early interaction between parents and infants, mothers helping babies to feel safe enough when if you're lucky to be in a situation where there was some safety, emotional safety to be had, because what it does is slows down the heart rate, slows down the respiration rate, and makes people feel safe to be engaged. If you think about the simple act of hugging, right, or being close to somebody, things that I think we're all really longing for those of us who are alone during this pandemic, we're searching for that hug, but you have to feel safe with somebody to feel that kind of connection. And what that does to the system is it puts it in a state of open engagement, where we can feel our sadness, our grief, our rage, our terror, can feel the feelings that are actually running through our system during this time. So we've got kind of freeze is our oldest part of the system we share with everybody. Fight or flight we share with all mammals. And this friend part also we share with kind of most sentient mammals. If you think of even like elephants or other kind of, evolved mammals that like we share these parts of
gorillas.
Yeah, gorillas too, right? You think about that bonding between why do elephant mothers or gorilla moms grieve when their or something happens to their babies, right? It's that kind of closeness and connection, and why those babies, how are they regulated? How do they feel close and connected, and how are they able to thrive in the world? It's not just emotional safety like warmth, but it's actually very physiological. Folks that we all travel up and down, like what John Balin calls through interstate travel. We all move up and down through our nervous system through these places, but it's really the quality of our early relationships and later on our friendships, our romantic relationships around us that help us stay in that friend place, that kind of open, engaged place where we can experience everything that we're feeling, right? Because we have to also, it doesn't evolutionarily make sense to really break down in a puddle when you're in fight and flight. It doesn't make evolutionary sense that if you're stuck in a freeze moment right now, if you're struggling to get out of bed, to be raging, right? Because it doesn't evolutionarily make sense. So we want to think about our nervous system spans and goes back and forth between these kind of, there's more kind of states. There's also calm and play. There's a couple others, but just for the conversation today, I think those are the three main ones for us to think about. And I think that this kind of friend place, our kind of vagals, our ventral vagal state, that's really the one I'd like to kind of talk about in terms of when we're thinking about resiliency. And
so is that why we interviewed Chloe Valderay, who has a consultancy called Theory of Enchantment. Yeah. And she made the observation that while we are spatially distant, physically separated from people close to us, we're actually more socially connected than we've been probably before. And why maybe so many people are gravitating towards these Zoom-like experiences where they're coming together in this friend state that you're talking about. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that the longing for it, I think this situation is going to activate all of our systems to seek out attachment figures. Who helps us to get into that place of felt sense of safety. I think probably in these different Zoom chats, and you could probably also experience it yourself, some work out really well where you can drop into that open engagement and others don't. Some might actually up you into kind of fight or flight. Some might drag you into kind of that freeze state. But I think at best, really what she's saying is that we are always social creatures. Yeah. That is always there. The pandemic, I think, reveals it, lays it bare for us, but we are always longing for connection. We are wired for it. We operate best in social communities and connections. So I think it lays it bare. That longing is always there, I feel. Yeah.
So you've on your website, you've put up a lot of resources that people can tap into. Yeah. And you're obviously maintaining your business with your team of therapists and the clients and patients you already have. Yeah. What advice can you share that might be useful for people who might be struggling in these different states that you're talking about? Sure. Just any practical advice, steps people can take.
Well, maybe one more step before we get to kind of practical advice is maybe, again, I would just say, I think I'm mentioning these because I think the advice really depends on who I'm speaking to, what nervous system I'm speaking to. Yeah. Right? And I think this is why I was saying when I kind of started with this concept that really, again, my old doctoral advisor really drilled into me, that we're built for these stressful events. It's not that they don't impact us, they don't existentially change us, but we're built for them in the sense that our nervous systems are built for them and we are adaptable to what our environment is. I think what this is also bringing out is what are the disparities of experiences that people have had in their lives. If you're born into a family where there's a lot of chaos and violence, where your nervous system is going to be, how it adapts, and why it might be getting more stuck in freeze or fight or flight is adaptable to that set of circumstances, right? If you're born in a country where there was predominantly a lot of political chaos and violence, also I think that there's been people who've been saying, I actually feel really fine and I'm actually really thriving. And I think that there's this sense of like, this feels kind of familiar to me. This is similar either to my family of origin or to the country I came from, right? So I think I also want to get us out of the idea of that, like, it's that our nervous systems adapt to kind of how we got wired, our genetics, and the environment that we're in. And so that's really how that's maybe how I would really encourage people to not be despairing about, well, it's bad to be stuck in freeze or it's bad to be stuck in fight or flight. It's just kind of how your nervous system adapted. And really where we want our nervous systems to go is this idea kind of be flexible, to be moving in and out of these states, not to just avoid them, because we're all going to get into them. I think this brings up, there's the pandemic itself and there's the self-limiting at home, but then there's all the other things that are going on for people, be it concerns about elderly parents or friends or neighbors, other illnesses or concerns. And we're just talking about a friend of a friend who's doing cancer treatments, right? So all of this is now going on. So the question is, what's our definition of resiliency, holding the idea that we've got these adaptive systems? And so I think that with that idea in mind, that it's not just about being in open engagement all the time, because that's just not possible. My system, I know for me, kind of what Dana kind of calls home away from home in my nervous system is fight or flight. I think the early days, and I think this is what I was also maybe just want to make a point, that there is also, I think, some data to suggest how we look acutely in the first 4 weeks of this is going to be different than how we look 3 months from now. So our system absorbing and adapting kind of to this newness of what's going on is going to look different than it does 3 months from now. Okay. So with all of that said, what do we do? Like, what do we do? And I think this is where what's really interesting, looking at what's getting posted around kind of, I hope kind of both in the resources that we're trying to offer and also the dialogue we're trying to kind of be in with other groups and healers and therapists and musicians and artists and people is not verbal so much. If you're thinking, for example, if you think about how do I get out of a freeze state when I'm feeling really low energy and really feeling like I am alone and I'm lost in the world and I'm feeling disconnected, I'm feeling underwater, right? If we really slow down and try to really find a moment, and I would encourage people who are listening to kind of just try to conjure up a moment that they've had in their own lives where they might be feeling this way. It's not words or stories or things. It starts to be really at like the really granular level of concrete things in terms of textures and tones and music and art. So if we think about what bypasses our nervous system to get it moving, in that sense, we want to get it upregulated. We want it to come up through the nervous system. We want to get it kind of going, want it to move a little bit into fight or flight, want to activate it. I would think about, breath. There's a lot of just thinking about regulating how are you breathing and trying to just to be aware of your surroundings, getting out of numbness and dissociation. So bring your body back into the room. So it might be breath work, meaning just breathing, trying to breathe not deeply or more slowly, but just tracking your breath along with some grounding and awareness of what is the textures of the bed that you're in? What's the temperature? Bringing yourself into bodily awareness with reality, bringing yourself back into the room, back into the moment. I think that the things that tend to bypass this again are not verbal things. Sometimes music can be a way of like matching your feeling. Can you, if you're there with your phone, can instead of watching something to tune out, can you find a song, something that can express what is the place that you are in? The tricky part of being in a freeze state is that you feel unreachable and you're likely the person who's not on those Zoom calls with friends. Right? So maybe you're a person who's listening to this alone and feels like,
you might be on the Zoom calls in bed, but not with video on.
That's right.
I mean, I've found in a lot of these calls that I've been on, a lot of people won't be putting the videos on for whatever reason.
Well, that might be, I think that's a really good guess.
Mm.
You know, I think it's like the people, like if I think about our group and like who I'm just checking with my staff and we're all moving, we're all in this too. We're all moving in and out of these states. And so I think when we're checking in on each other, we're starting to get nervous about the people that we're not hearing from or the one word answers. Right. And I think, again, this is where I think people who are in those states, I would want to invite them to not move into a shame state about being in freeze. It's just what your body knew. It's just what it does when it's under stress. There's absolutely, I truly believe in whatever years or wisdom I have on this planet, it's there for a good reason. And so I'd say start slow and just try to bring yourself literally, bodily, physically back into the world, right? With music, with feeling textures, things around you, with noticing things that literally bring you back into the room, back into the world, that try to stay present focused. So I think that's, I guess, like as a practical tip, it's I guess it's that. And all of these have to have like heaps of compassion for how difficult that is to do on your own. We do so much better coming back to life with another. So if you are alone and you are stuck in freeze, have deep compassion for yourself and start small. And if you realize that you're on the phone with somebody who's not on the video or isn't saying much, it may sound really weird, but do a Zoom call with no video and just say, I'm here. Have a cup of coffee together. Don't demand more from that person to upregulate them. Just be with them where they are at and give them some cues in some sense. I'm still here. now I'm taking a bite of toast. Can you take a bite of toast with me? Like, you just start really simply. I think so I think that there's grounding, there's getting just oriented with really present, focused reality, textures, tones, things that aren't so verbal, because we just don't have any access to that. It's a very kind of old primitive state in the brain. Yeah.
Okay. This is very good advice. So,
yeah.
Okay. All right.
That's like maybe speaking to our dorsal folks, or like for me, that state is like Ithaca for me, Ithaca, New York. So next maybe fight or flight, maybe for me, when I think about when I had to do my polyvagal ladder in my workshop with Devdina, I kind of put New York City there, and New York City really I consider home, but internally is also kind of my home away from home. Even just, I'm not in New York City currently. I think personally, I'm finding a lot of mismatch with being so far outside the city in a place geographically in the south of the US where things aren't as impactful, and there's less of a sense of in the community, no one's able to kind of match what I'm feeling and what I know is going on with friends and people in the room. But anyway, so that's just my little shorthand for like my New York City place inside, that kind of high energy, high intensity, high electricity, fight or flight. I was even, in a certain way, in many ways, creating the resource page was totally from my New York City place in my nervous system. Let's do something. And it was with this kind of good relational intention of like, let's set up something that's about giving and receiving and being at different places, and something that was communal and creating dialogue, and all those things are true. But I think it came from this place of like, let's act. Yeah. I think that different from dorsal, that's really about kind of waking up gently. I think when we're talking about fight or flight, modes of energy, I think then again, we're not talking about verbally dominated ways to help people out. I think when people are really in panic states, when they're waking up in the middle of the night, we really don't have access to a lot of words and logic at that point. Daniel Siegel famously kind of talks about, and it's maybe a little more helpful that we're on video, if this is the brain, and this is the brain stem, and this is the amygdala, and this is the prefrontal cortex, like we're sitting like this, that when we're in fight or flight, our lid is flipped, meaning we're like in that place, that amygdala place, dominated place that like is in our neuroception, threat detection, let's mobilize, let's act. So again, it might be in a different way, very consciously coming again back to the body, and how do you downregulate yourself? So instead of kind of using maybe breath work, yoga, physical exercise, music to upregulate, now we're wanting to think about things that are in a very conscious way help to slow us down. I know for me, and it's very new practice, but I think for me, this is kind of where I have to come back to some kind of both meditation practice, but I have to say, to be candid, if I wasn't finding some way to physically move, and I've been doing it in the room that I'm working from. I think as a lot of people have been doing, the working and exercising like literally within 3 feet of each other. I think some of that is like getting some energy discharge. We know that also exercise has really good effects for discharge, in increasing kind of our endorphins. We know it's got really good physical impact for me. That's how my anxiety is getting regulated, through some exercise and meditation, kind of the combination of the two. And that also sometimes like having like little dance parties in my room, because again, having music that's a little bit matching where I'm at, that's attuning to where I am, that nobody's there to say, yeah, everyone's really amped up and really freaked out and scared today. But there's something about like music or dance music or something, house music, that like helps match a certain feeling. And there's something about that just goes, okay, yeah, this is where my body is at, just kind of just feeling it, acknowledging it, and then thinking about ways to then move it down. So that's like, if there's like the exercise or dancing or kind of listening to higher energy music is up here, there's something that once it's attuned to, then I can slow down. I tend to kind of, for myself, just personally, do some kind of physical movement first, and then I can meditate. And then I can use breath of just coming back to just a regular, even kind of not trying to like force it, any kind of like, I know that for some people, holding breath and working with breath is also a very deliberate way, like meaning counting your breath of inhaling to 5, exhaling for 5 is another way that potentially helps to downregulate. That doesn't work for me, but I find that kind of, again, some kind of breath and body work is another way to downregulate your system. Yeah. It's
going to be interesting.
Yeah.
If people are doing this, and I've spoken to quite a few friends that are doing, as you say, an exercise regime while they're doing it at their standing desks they've assembled in their house.
Yes.
When people go back to work and they're being told, what are you doing getting down the floor doing these press-ups or squats in the middle of the office?
Because it's parts of what might change. Who knows after all of that?
It is.
I think
it could have a radical impact on work and office life.
Right. And I just maybe want to add, I think that's what you're saying, Mark, is making me think again about me trying to also think about resiliency here and thinking about it relationally. Because I think as I'm talking, I'm very aware that those are kind of like the old kind of frames of mind of just thinking about it individually. And I think that it is important to be thinking of those way. But I would also say to both those states and thinking about what one might want to do, I do think this is where, when I was saying, even being on the phone with no video with somebody and having an intention to connect is really important. And the same thing, there's something about, there's like a little, kind of counter on the meditation app I use that shows you how many people are meditating with you. And I think there is something about leaning into the community experience, or even just when people are cueing me in to remember, there's so many other people at home right now doing this too, because I think that that's the thing that starts to tap into that open, engaged part of me, to think about the larger world, to think about the larger community of people and what we're all trying to go through, which is, in a sense, I don't know if we, being confronted with our mortality in one way or the other.
What's your meditation app?
I think it's just called like Meditation Timer. I'll have to find it for you so you can maybe find it.
Wait a minute. It's the Insight Timer.
Insight Timer, yes.
Instant Timer. Yeah, I know the one you mean. Yeah, it's lovely.
It's very, very simple, but you're not on with a lot of other people, but you can see at the end, I was meditating with X number of people today. And I try to hold that in mind. And I also try to hold it in mind as a little baby Buddhist, burgeoning kind of new Buddhist. I'm trying to go to the classes from my meditation center online. And the instructor is always saying, remember, there's so many of you at home right now watching this too. You're here like having this experience with me, just one-on-one with this screen, but there's so many other people having this experience too. And I think, why is that important? Again, if we think about how it might prime us both to what are the places where we feel more connected? What are the places where we feel our community? Because what we know, what we're starting to kind of see as it relates to resiliency kind of research, is that their community cohesion is something that is protective, potentially, in even in things that, even in situations like 9/11, in situations like the kind of the double, triple whammies, depending on which stressors you're trying to identify, the financial crisis back in 2008 and then Hurricane Sandy, when you're kind of looking at, this goes back to George Bonanno's lab and his work, when you're looking at what defines resiliency, and they would also define it as like some flexibility, being able to express and be able to move in and out of these states, right? Versus like emotional rigidity would be getting kind of stuck in these states. Some of it is community cohesion. I mean, I think some of the things that we've been talking about in our friend chats have been these very powerful moments where we've been feeling so moved by how people have been showing up for each other. Mm-hmm. And what does that do to signal to people that you're here? There's other people here, that even if you're alone in your apartment, other people are looking out for you. It kind of challenges a certain assumption of like that I'm alone in the world. And there could be very good reasons why certain people feel that more than others. But I think this is a time to be thinking of, getting away from the idea of like the rugged individual, and it's just going to be about how we pick ourselves up by the bootstraps. I don't think that was ever true. I think that that's a way to protect ourselves against how vulnerable we really are in the world. So I think leaning into the idea of community and how many people are going through this too, and are going through similar things, are moving in and out of these states in our nervous system that are struggling. I think like that's kind of part of acknowledging our own vulnerability and connecting with the kindness and thoughtfulness of others, I think is important.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was the second stage.
Yeah.
What about the third stage?
The open and engaged stage, I mean, I think this is kind of where if you kind of find yourself with kind of in that kind of ventral vagal state, right? Feeling open and engaged. I mean, I think this is really where, how can we expand it? I think kind of once you're there, I know that there's people who are really trying to, through this different stress, if they're finding themselves in a place of calm and they want to intensify it, and they're feeling like they're able to access their emotions. Because again, that state is like feeling safe to feel your feelings. So this is, I think, where people are doing art. I know that there's friends of mine who have gone on to do other things in their life, but are going back to drawing and singing and songwriting or journaling or just being with a friend. And instead of kind of giving the nice answer about like, oh, this is what I'm doing with my time, or these are the languages I'm learning, just having a good cry or there's a good kind of rage or venting session. I mean, I think there's a lot of beautiful things going on, but I think this time is also laying bare the inequities in our world. And so I think being in that open, engaged state just means, how can I expand it? How can I be there? And also, again, have a lot of tenderness to know I'm going to be moving back in and out of those other states too. And that my resiliency is not the avoidance of those feelings or avoidance of those states. It's just riding the waves back up to kind of an open engagement where I can, in that place, feel my feelings. And if I'm really lucky, make sense of how I'm feeling with another person. It could be joy and excitement about creativity. And again, it could be these other states too, but it's kind of, that's really where we want to stay. We want to expand. We want to think about that is a state where our lids are on, our heart is open. We feel kind of most like ourselves, and we can really be who we are. We can kind of stand in the light and know I can say anything to this Zoom chat group that I'm on. Like, I'm having a really hard day. I was on a call last night with some friends. I don't have children myself, but all have children, and a couple of them were just saying, I'm really struggling. I'm not having this grand time of like finding myself. Then I'm not meditating. I'm just trying to get through the day. I'm just trying to get through the laundry. I'm just trying to get through the readjusting to dealing with the stress of worrying about my business and my livelihood and trying to take care of my kids and deal with the homeschooling and everything else like that. But that might sound like a frozen place or a fight or flight place, but it's really coming from an open, engaged place, because it's feeling safe to just be who you are, say how you feel how you feel, and make sense of it. To feel, as Diana Fosha says, to be able to feel and deal, to stay with it, stay with another. Feel and deal. Feel and deal, right? Feel and deal comes from open and engaged. So it's not like just open and engaged isn't just about like happiness and ecstasy, although it could be. It's about having that feeling, having access to it truly, because sometimes real joy is very vulnerable. Like if you're in a place where this is a time where it's giving you a break and you're really realizing some things about yourself that you're grieving for a former self, you're excited about something new, you're making some transitions, but to really share that with someone else still takes safety and takes internal safety in your nervous system. But so if you're there, it's just giving yourself permission to stay there, to deepen it, to expand it, stay with that person, take the chance, say a little more, make sense of it, feel it, go through it. That's what I would say. Feel and deal. Yeah. So
given your experience of having seen this and been here in 9/11, and you said that it was very much the people in the building and around it in close proximity. What's your sense of when we talk about the new normal and the return to normalcy? I mean, what do you feel is going to happen?
Right.
3 months, 6 months down the line?
Right. I mean, I think where this is really different, and I think what probably goes on a broken record about this, is that in a way, the trauma or the stressor, for those of us who are not on the front lines, and I want to be really clear, I'm not a frontline worker, so I'm not a medical professional in a hospital. I'm not a grocery store clerk. I'm not a delivery person, and all of the incredible other people who are on the front line, who I would consider to be maybe comparable to those high exposure folks that were in the World Trade Center, right? Is that the stressor for those of us who are not in those frontline positions, who are not actually witnessing death or being put repetitively in situations of exposure to the illness, is uncertainty, right? So none of us know exactly when this is going to be over. There's some modeling about it. There's some thinking about it. There's some kind of evidence maybe from other cities, but there's then evidence to not trust it. So I think that there's a little bit of a difference in the sense of the uncertainty of the time frame that we're working in. That said, I think that's going to be very unique. I think that's the challenge that this kind of situation is calling to all of our nervous systems. And some people, again, because of their experiences in the world, have a lot more experience with uncertainty, have a lot more experience with the inequities of the government, have a lot more experiences with ways that of not being taken care of in the medical system and different forms of oppression, right? So even with that said, my sense would be what we're going to see a year out is certainly with some of these things, as you're saying, substance use, being elevated, symptoms of depression and anxiety elevated, but I don't think we're going to see that a year out because we're built to adapt. Mm-hmm. I do think that there will be people who are going to have more of a struggle, and the question is, who is that going to be and why? And I think that that's a big question to answer. My sense would be that looking at kind of data from other kind of post-traumatic growth or kind of resiliency projects, really it does relate around how did you come into this experience in terms of what's your prior history with depression and anxiety, kind of what's your internal propensity. And I would say like from this model to really get stuck and freeze, to get stuck again with that kind of rigidity in your system around fight or flight, my guess would be those folks are going to have a harder time. I think that, that there's, sorry, go ahead.
No, one of the things that I've been wondering about is just the, depending on how, if you can get your hands on any sort of Clorox or sanitizer, the behaviors that we are being encouraged to adopt are bordering on OCD. Yes. And I just wonder if that will linger and how people will overcome that and go back onto subways or the metro or the underground in London to go into cinemas, be sitting next to each other, to be in opera or theatres where you're crammed, and on gigs. I mean, 6 weeks ago, I was with my friend Graham at a gig here in Williamsburg, packed in, everyone. And you just can't imagine how people are going to embrace those old behaviors after being told distancing. Right. You just don't suddenly drop it like that and go back to normal, I don't think. I'd love your perspective on the psychological state.
I think, again, this is where I don't feel Pollyanna-ish. So I don't want to minimize the concern, but I think I say that I think we will adapt because, again, I really believe in my core, it's what we've been wired to do. If you look at any system of atrocity, again, it doesn't. You look at the Holocaust. You look at acts of
Rwanda genocide.
Genocide. How did they adapt? How did they go? This is like really. It's not that. It is. There are so many places of terror and fear and people putting their lives on the line that have to do with the frontline workers. And I think, and for internal terror and fear, because again, we're all longing for connection right now. It's a stressful time. So we're all longing for our people, whether real or kind of our internalized versions of those people, to comfort us and to soothe us. So I believe we're going to adapt. And I think there's going to be the people that it's harder for are folks that we've really got to take a really good look at, because it speaks to who we haven't been taking good care of all along, right? I think So I think what will kind of these kind of what will happen with these OCD behaviors? If it's any evidence, I have a friend, Kate McKnight, whose specialty is working with OCD, and I asked her, "How are your clients doing?" And she said, "Great."
Loving it.
Well, but I think in some ways it matches a little bit, like their inside now matches their outside, but she was saying it from a place of they know what to do, because so much of OCD as kind of the psychological description of that phenomenon is an anxiety disorder that deals with uncertainty. They're just behaviors to deal with uncertainty. And so I'd come back again to think like at the heart of this, really, if we're thinking about what is resiliency, what makes us resilient, it's going to be maybe what to do in those states to kind of help our nervous systems get more flexible, to move more and more in those states of open engagement, to feel and deal and be connected, right? That's kind of my definition. Mm-hmm. But I think that I just lost my train of thought, but I think, anyway.
OCD, yeah.
OCD, yeah, that they're doing okay because they know kind of what to do. And this was my thought, that they've had to deal with uncertainty. And a lot of the treatment for OCD is about exposure to the things that are terrifying and fearful. There could be potentially coming out of this, if we're having to deal with the uncertainty of who's going to make me sick, how long is this going to last, that our tolerance for uncertainty grows during this time, potentially. How does it grow? I think you have to be in that kind of more open, engaged, ventral vagal place to be able to confront, I think, again, like, this is just, again, my personal bias, I think what different religions and faiths, and certainly the Buddhists do, confront death and uncertainty. We're all going to die. That's when and how is the biggest uncertainties and mysteries of life, but really there's echoes of this, and I think there's echoes of it in there's a body of thinking called terror management theory in psychology. And so a lot of, I was reading some articles looking at essentially terror management theory is the idea that so much of our anxiety and our behaviors in life are all around our unconscious management of the human capacity to know we are going to die. And that it rules our decision-making, not in our conscious thinking, like, who am I going to vote for? What am I going to do? Am I going to eat healthy? That's like a conscious thought, like, I'm going to eat healthy, so I'm going to live longer. The unconscious part is knowing we have no control. We're just the same as the animals and the plant life, and we're all part of the circle of life. It's completely overwhelming and horrifying to sit with that. But I think that there's something about whether it's OCD is a very specific kind of psychological phenomena, or just being human, there's something about engaging with that uncertainty, mortality being the biggest one of them, that I think building up our capacity to engage with it in a healthy way, in a productive way, might lead to less need to do big shares of power or acts of violence. I think if we're really understanding we're all going to die, it changes maybe bigger kind of power grabs for we take these resources or we keep these people oppressed. So, I mean, that's my very idealistic, maybe it's a little intellectual, but it's also my hope for myself is trying to stay in this experience and not be above it. And also kind of watching for myself as a helper and watching the helpers around us, again, with that instinct to want to help, to be above the worry versus in it. And in it with our clients, in it with friends, in it with people listening to this podcast, that we're all in it. And if we're all in it really, and no amount of toilet paper or, Grey Goose vodka from the liquor store, or, if you're out in California or Colorado or some of the other amazing places in the world where weed is legal, marijuana, there's no amount of that's going to get us out of that universal truth. And so then how do we start to deal with each other and really take care of each other if we're not just crazy fighting over all of these resources? That's what I'm wondering these days.
It's great way to wrap up and leave people to reflect. But I think Elaine wants to have ask, or Bettina, you might as well. So I'm going to go on mute because Elaine's in the same room. So just bear with me a second.
Sure.
Well, I find really interesting the part of the safer environment. And I think this is a time where you start to see in some of your friends and communities which are the ones that make you feel safer and which ones are not.
Yeah.
I think after this, there will be a moment where we will start building safer communities.
Yeah.
What would your take be on that?
Yeah, I think it's really true because I think, again, just going back to, I think that there's so much discussion about the body amongst maybe people in the mental health community and just thinking about what are resources, what are tactics, and also just giving great credit to, both Deb Dina and Stephen Porges and the sensory motor and somatic experiencing folks that have all along been kind of letting the body and the nervous system lead. And I think because we're so much more aware than we might be on kind of a regular day of how does this situation make me feel? Because I feel like my resources are more limited now. My bandwidth is less. So I can't tolerate that friend or that relative that minimizes my experience, that can't tolerate being with me when I'm in a dorsal state, when I'm in a fight or flight state, when I'm in a Ithaca or New York City state, or my open and engaged might be I don't know, some of the incredible beaches in Bali or places I've been to that are just kind of magical, right? That if they can't be with me in those darker places, they can only be with me when I'm at kind of my best. Then I don't have time for it because it actually detracts, or it actually starts to almost feel painful or infuriating. So I think that this is maybe a moment that maybe people are doing a little bit of culling of both what are activities and situations and roles and jobs that I just realize I don't have the time and bandwidth for, but certainly people too, who really makes me feel like I can just say and be who I am in whatever moment that I am. That I think that those people are really so precious and rare. And, as I think, keep alluding to, Elaine, you're a huge part of that. You're certainly part of my system that makes me feel safe and engaged and open, and that I can be having a good day or bad day, or, and I know that you'll just be with me however I am. So I think that I really think it's important. I think that that's maybe part of, again, along the edges of this experience. I think that there's a lot happening in people's relationships, in their marriages and partnerships too. I think there's a lot being written about, okay, now I'm home with my spouse 24/7. I'm my partner. I'm working out. I mean, if we're fortunate to be working, or dealing with the financial stressors, which is a whole other thing that I want to add into this mix about resiliency, and stressors that is going on for so many people. I feel like that there's a health issue, and then there's just economic devastation that's going on throughout the world, right? But people who can be with me in my worries and my concerns, and I think are incredibly valuable people. And I'm very lucky that we're one of those people in my life. Yeah.
Thank you. Me too. Definitely, I think there is a huge opportunity for also the work environment to build these safer places in the longer term.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think so. And I think this is maybe, it's a call to action. I think that certainly many large companies have been trying to figure out what does health and wellness mean? And certainly, understandably, what does it mean for the bottom line? But I think at a time like this, what they're really realizing is that it's even bigger maybe than the bottom line, we hope. Not all companies, but I think, I know Mark and you all on the Possible Network had Lorna Davis on, who I find to be an incredibly wise and resourceful person who's involved with the B Corp movement, and was when she was at Danone. And the B Corp, which I didn't know about prior to meeting Lorna, is an organization that helps industries organize for the greater good. And I think, again, where those companies and where those CEOs, what is the kind of, where do they need to be in their nervous system, I think, to begin to think in those ways that it's not about this competition for resources. That's kind of from this older way of resources are scarce and we're all, we got to get it while we can, and we got to compete to win, to we're all going to win if our employees are healthy, they have a place in the world, that there's a sense where they can feel supported here in our community, and that we together can take on these bigger issues, whether you're a food manufacturer or you make shoes or clothing or are in IT or tech, that they might seem not disconnected from the community. But I think what we're all experiencing, if we can really let ourselves be with it, is just how connected we are, and also, how connected we are. I mean, I think just for the purposes of what you're saying. So my hope would be, I know it's the intention of our resource page for our group that it's a conversation. I mean, first and foremost, it was a way for our group to have more connections with each other. It's both my kind of fight or flight New York City nervous system project, but then it's also for our group to have a common project to be working on. And also so that I have another friend, a really lovely, one of my other my other safe, open, engaged person is my really dear friend, Elena, who runs a marketing group out of Athens and London. And so she's helping us with our social media. So it's this way to be connected, and it's a way for us to engage in conversations and look at all these other healers and therapists and look at what they're doing. And let's see if we can kind of share resources with each other, because it's not about like who's going to get the most clients, but it's really, how do we have this conversation and learn from each other and be with each other and support each other, because helping all of those other entities out is a win for everybody, right? It's kind of changing that mindset. So my sincere hope would be that there's a way that more CEOs can get in that frame of mind, and certainly ones that have larger company footprints than our my beloved Rennicke Associates group.
And if people want to read your resources, check it out, where do they find it?
They can go to RennickeAssociates.com, and some very brilliant web designers have created a way for you to just redirect directly to the COVID-19 resource page. And I think the way that is set up is both in receiving nourishment, receiving wisdom, and giving wisdom, with the idea, again, that we're all in this, and we might be at different arcs of the wave of kind of our nervous systems. And there's days when we just need our nervous systems fed. We need support. So we're really trying to focus on the online groups that we're trying to do, and other kind of colleagues have recommended other people who are kind of doing online community support groups. Giving nourishment is really kind of when you're in a place where you're feeling more resourced that day and have a bit to give back to the group. And the same for wisdom, about learning and about giving learning. So that's kind of the way that the page is set up. But you can find it at RennickeAssociates.com.
Okay. And if people wanted to follow you, Bettina's got a question.
Yeah.
Hold on a second.
Okay, so you work a lot with children, and
yes.
So my question is more catered to the children in situations like this. Especially, I mean, I know the smaller children might be a little bit more oblivious of what's really going on. Some parents might protect them and not tell them what's going on because they are fearful that they might have traumas over too much information. Some other parents share everything because they feel like oversharing and letting them know exactly what's going on is a better way. So what do you think, it's a two-part question. First is like, what would your advice be to the listeners of how to deal with its own children? Like what is right to let them know without them creating anxiety at a very early, very young age, and therefore, consequential traumas.
Yeah.
And the second part is like, what if there are children that are prone to anxiety already at that young age and find out what's going on, develop even more or further stress syndrome? What would be your advice to parents on how to best deal in this situation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I know a lot of people are thinking about parents and families these days. And I think maybe, and Bettina, just help me out if I'm not answering all the pieces, but I think maybe just again to kind of level set, I think the way that we work with children is not as individuals. We always think about them in context of their family. And so I think that the way that I think about it first in terms of, before I even think about information, is I think about where is that parent in terms of where are they in their nervous system. So we always talk a lot about, parents putting their oxygen masks on first. So before we even get to content, we really got to get to the process of, our parents in a place where they're feeling supported enough, that they have their lids on enough, to have a conversation with a child. I think what we really feel is that when parents are resourced, and again, not just because of the pandemic, but I think the economic stress, the stress around feeding families, the stress and uncertainty about unemployment, or for folks that are in gig economy or independent contractors, when that stuff is coming back. I mean, we're talking about parents under enormous stress, or even just trying to work out how to work at home if they're fortunate to have a job, and also be dealing with all the extra demands of homeschooling, right? So there's a lot of reasons, and again, with a lot of grace and compassion for parents to have for themselves, why you might be, again, in fight or flight, in freeze. Help yourself kind of come back as best you can. Who are the safe people in your life? The other adults you can talk with on the phone, you can Zoom with if you can do that, to get resource. Because from that place, what we really believe is that we want parents to be honest with their kids. We want them to give it developmentally, kind of appropriately. But our big thing is that children always know, just like because they're people. Mm-hmm. So they know when stuff is going on. They know when things are unusual. So naming it together and being able to name, this is what I'm worried about. This is what I'm hopeful for. This is what I'm frustrated about. And we haven't actually yet talked about grief, but I think grief is such a big part of, I know what people are experiencing, not just grief for people who are passing during this time, which is, I think, a whole other, maybe very specialized and maybe important conversation to be having, because rituals of grief in families are being completely upended and interrupted. But we really feel parents can say anything to their kids from a regulated space, because the whole part of connection and empathy and regulation of emotion is attunement and empathy. So if a kid's experience can be named, if they're feeling a lot of tension in the house, if a parent can be in a regulated space and say, it's pretty nuts around here, huh? Everything is upside down. All of our routines are upside down, or, whatever it might be. Or you're really sad and you're experiencing a lot of grief, because I know for a lot of our high school students or college students, they're not going to have their graduation, they're not going to have their proms and rites of passages. All of that's being interrupted, right? So to name that and to be able to be with their kids and talk about the fears, I think that there's something, we don't know everything. I think that I know parents all over the world are feeling fairly relieved that we do know enough that this is not impacting kids as much. So I think that that seems like, as best we know, that's true enough. And yet they're a whole part of carriers of why they can't see grandma, grandpa, aunts and uncles, other parts of their extended and found families, is because even though the kids themselves might not get sick, it's also a lesson in teaching kids about community. And again, going back to the sense of community resiliency, and that they can have a sense of pride about taking part in helping to protect a more vulnerable member of their group of friends or family or neighbors, right? So I think regulated parent who's got their oxygen mask on, can say just about anything to their kids and be with them and be ready to deal with the feelings that are coming up. Mm-hmm. And we really suggest to be candid with kids as best and in developmentally appropriate way. I know that even I have a nephew who's 2, and he's just beginning to be really verbal. And so he's often asking, he wants to go to the park. He wants to see a friend. He doesn't understand why not. Now he's 2. He's not, he's pretty oblivious, but they just say it's because of the bug. There's a bug. Mm-hmm. So that's on the very, the younger end, but I think being candid and being emotionally able to process whatever's coming up, boredom, frustration, anger, whatever it is, fear is important. And I think if there's financial stuff going on for you as a family, again, this is where to be developmentally appropriate, but don't hide it from your kids, because we really feel, again, where name it in a developmentally appropriate way, that yes, we lost our job and this is what we're hoping for. And that is just going to mean we got to make a couple different decisions about, we're going to make extra coupons, or we have to kind of be careful about what we're buying at the grocery store. And you can be helpful in the family. And this is how. It's my job to look for jobs, and it's my job to get, funding from the government or the different relief that's starting to come through. And your job is just to help me try to help the family understand that this is some of the things that are going to have to be different, and that it's scary, and to be with those feelings as they emerge. So I don't know if that answers those different parts of it.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. The part two of my question, I'm not sure if we have time to get into this, was really, what about the flip side? If you don't have a family that is understanding and has the oxygen mask on, family members, and you are part of as a child in a family where there's a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of worry and a lot of anger as a consequence. And with anger comes abuse.
Yep.
And like, what do you do? Like, how do you protect? How does the government or social services, or how does the school protect these children? Because now they don't go to school. So where are they getting their safety net from?
Thank you for naming this. We know, here's the reality. We know that there are hotlines up not only for child abuse, but also domestic violence we know is going to be rising during this time. We have a lot of stressed out people in close quarters. I think every single child therapist that I am speaking to is very, very scared to terrified about what's happening in many, many homes across the world right now. I wish I had an easy answer to it, and I don't. I know that there are very dedicated people on hotlines that are still taking calls. As at least when we put them up, the ones that are on our site under the kind of the protection part of our resource page are there both for child abuse and for domestic violence. There's also a special domestic violence number there for folks that are in the LGBTQ community. So we're scared about it. And I think that, like everything else, folks on those hotlines are doing the best they can. And I have to be certain that all of those services of protection are being interrupted. Because a lot of what those child protective services, they may be able to take the call. I'm not entirely sure. It's something that I want to continue to check in with. I don't know what's happening in terms of in-home visits for safety. All of those calls have to be followed up on. I know in cases of for child abuse and also for domestic violence, this kind of, home is not always what is safest. I think this is another maybe point off of, we're talking about friendships and people who you're calling and interacting with online or over phones or socially distancing out in the world and seeing. But home is not a safe place for many, many, many millions of people. So I think that this is, again, it comes back to, we're in this moment now. How do we stay with both the experience that we're having, knowing that many members of our community are having these experiences and worse, and not forget about them? How do we start to build up the resources for these folks, that when we start to come back out of self-limited home, that there's going to be places of safety for them? I wish there was something I could say to say, but it's something I'm really, really scared about. So I'm not sure what to do about that one, because I think everybody in protective services is doing the best they can right now, and I don't know what we can do. Yeah, but I think it's really important to think about, and I think it goes back again to this feeling that we're all having to relate to our lives differently because of the pandemic. But I think when people say, like, we're all in this together, I think why some people bristle is because we're not all in the same place together. So it's like, what's the point of resiliency we're speaking of? Is it like my resiliency? What does that even mean? I'm able to be in a room I don't have other family members staying in this room. I'm able to work. So my nervous system is still being impacted. I'm not going to shortchange that, but it's starting from a different place. And I think a lot of other people's resiliency has to start from, in terms of also just the systemic barriers and historical barriers to access to care and other things. So I think it's like, whose resiliency and what are the solutions? Because I think that there's a lot of places where we can get politically active here, and where therapists and mental health folks might need to get a lot more active and thinking about. We know, for example, even with, this doesn't necessarily speak to maybe child abuse and protection, Bettina, but I think that, a lot of mental health folks started to volunteer low cost or free services. I know myself included, I did that. Why? In the middle of all of this, did we start to do that for frontline people? It's because intuitively, there's not enough resources in the system. Mm-hmm. Medically, we know there's not enough resources in the system. I mean, this is a time to maybe to start to get campaigns together to think about advocacy at our professional association level, at political levels. I know that there's movements also, again, to think about what does resiliency mean for the folks that are incarcerated right now? Can it mean that also can we, for folks that are not incarcerated, advocate for their safe care and treatment, or for their release for nonviolent offenders, or for the different kind of advocate?
They have New York City.
For sure.
Yeah, they have released violent offenders.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's a time to kind of stay curious about these things and think about resiliency for who, and can we help continue to kind of create more resources in the system so more people can get into this place of open engagement to thrive, or have more experiences where they're allowed to kind of reach their potential. So
okay.
Well, Courtney, I think it's been about an hour and 10 minutes, so I think we should maybe wrap it up there. But sure. Thank you so much for your time. I don't think we're going to do much editing here. I think we're just going to probably put a little intro and outro on it, and then just post it. So we'll share the link with you. It'll be on YouTube fairly soon, and it'll be an audio on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
So
really,
thank you very much.
Thank you guys too, because I feel like this gives some meaning to. It was nice to have some, again, output for this. I guess maybe I just feel appreciative that this provides me some outlet for meaning in my life. So I really appreciate you reaching back out, and it's really nice to see, in the Zoom way. I don't know how you're editing it, but I get to see all of your faces. It feels very, again, not individually centered. It feels very like a communal effort. And so I can't wait till we're all in the same room together again. But thank you guys so much for taking time on Easter Sunday to listen to me blather on.
Thank you.